There's nothing quite like the emptiness of a bed that once held two. When grief leaves you standing alone in a world that suddenly feels dangerous, sometimes the heart makes choices that surprise everyone, including yourself. Signe knew she needed protection after her husband died. At the warrior auction, she could have chosen any fighter. Instead, she raised her hand for the giant Viking everyone feared, Fenrik Ironhowl. The village thought she'd lost her mind buying a battle-scarred berserker who barely spoke. What they didn't know was simple. What she didn't know was even simpler. Fenrik had loved her for years. Through her entire marriage, he'd watched from afar, fighting distant battles to forget what he couldn't have. Now she'd bought him. Now he belonged to her household. Now, for the first time in his life, the woman he loved was sleeping under the same roof. But can a man who's spent years hiding his heart finally learn to speak it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like a shroud, and Signe Eriksdottir pulled her woolen cloak tighter as she walked the familiar path to old Astrid's cottage. Her healing satchel, worn leather softened by years of use, bounced gently against her hip with each step. Inside, carefully wrapped bundles of dried herbs rustled, willow bark for pain, chamomile for sleepless nights, and yarrow for wounds that refused to heal. 3 months had passed since Magnus died, and the village of Ironwood had grown colder toward her with each sunrise. Not in harsh words or cruel gestures, but in the subtle ways that mattered more. The nods became shorter. The greetings grew perfunctory. The requests for her healing services came less frequently, and when they did, the payment offered was smaller, as if her skills had somehow diminished along with her husband's protection. She understood the logic, even if it cut deep. A woman alone was a liability in a world where strength determined survival. Magnus had been respected, not feared like some of the younger warriors, but respected for his steady nature and fair dealings. His sword arm might have slowed with age, but his reputation kept the wolves at bay. Now those same wolves were beginning to circle, and everyone could smell the blood in the water. Astrid's cottage sat at the edge of the village proper, where the cultivated fields gave way to wild forest. The old woman had been bedridden for weeks now, her joints swollen and painful, despite every remedy Signe had tried. As she approached the weathered door, she could hear voices inside. Astrid's grandson, Bjorn, and another man she didn't recognize. "Telling you, grandmother, she's not safe on her own," Bjorn was saying as Signe knocked. "The Ironclad brothers have been asking questions about her land. They remember how fertile those southern fields were before Magnus claimed them." The ivy door opened to reveal Bjorn's worried face. He was a good man, barely 25, with his grandfather's honest eyes and his father's broad shoulders. Behind him, Signe glimpsed a stranger, a lean man with calculating eyes who nodded once and excused himself, brushing past her with barely concealed disdain. "Signe," Bjorn said, relief evident in his voice. "Grandmother's been asking for you." Inside the small cottage, Astrid lay propped against worn furs, her once bright eyes now cloudy with pain and age. But her mind remained sharp as the day she'd taught Signe which mushrooms could heal and which could kill. "Child," Astrid said, extending a gnarled hand, "come close. We need to speak plainly." Signe knelt beside the bed, automatically reaching for the old woman's wrist to check her pulse, strong still but irregular. "How is the pain today?" "Manageable, but that's not what concerns me." Astrid's grip was surprisingly firm. Bjorn spoke truth. "The Ironclad brothers circle like ravens. They want your land, and without Magnus's sword to defend it, they'll find a way to take it." The Ironclad brothers, Ulf and Erik, controlled much of the village's trade and held sway over many of the younger warriors. They'd been Magnus's rivals for decades, held in check only by his reputation and alliances. With him gone, those same alliances were proving as fragile as morning frost. I know, Signe said quietly, but what choice do I have? I can't simply abandon everything Magnus built. You need protection, Astrid said bluntly, and not the kind that comes from hoping old friends remember their debts. You need a warrior bound to your service, someone whose strength serves only you. Signe had been avoiding this conversation for weeks, but she couldn't deny the truth any longer. 3 times now she'd found her fields trampled by wandering livestock. Twice her herb garden had been damaged by careless children who ran before she could catch them. And yesterday she'd discovered someone had been in her home while she was tending to patients. Nothing taken, but drawers opened, belongings moved. A message as clear as if it had been carved into her door. The warrior auction, Bjorn said from across the room. It's tomorrow. Signe's stomach tightened. The annual auction was a tradition as old as the village itself. When warriors were captured in raids or battles, when men fell into debt they couldn't pay, when the desperate needed coin more than pride, they ended up on the auction block. Most were purchased as laborers or household guards, their terms of service clearly defined. Some earned their freedom through faithful service, others found their situations too comfortable to leave. I have some silver, Signe said slowly. Magnus was careful with our savings, but the good warriors, the ones with reputations, they command high prices. Not all of them, Astrid said with a knowing look. Some come with reputations that make men nervous about bidding. Fear can be as valuable as skill, child, if you're brave enough to wield it. That evening, Signe sat in her empty house, staring at the leather pouch that contained her life savings. 47 pieces of silver. Enough to purchase a decent fighter, but not one of the proven champions who would command respect through reputation alone. She'd need to be clever, or lucky, or both. The house felt too large around her, filled with echoes of the life she'd shared with Magnus. He'd been a good husband, kind, steady, patient with her interest in healing arts, when other men might have demanded she focus solely on domestic duties. Their marriage had been arranged, as most were, but genuine affection had grown between them over the years. Not the passionate love of the scald songs, but something deeper and more enduring, or so she'd thought, until death had severed it, as cleanly as a blade. Now she faced choices Magnus had never wanted her to make. The idea of purchasing another human being, even temporarily, sat uneasily in her stomach. But the alternative, losing everything, becoming dependent on the charity of relatives who already whispered about her unseemly independence, was worse. The next morning dawned clear and cold. The auction was held in the village square, where a platform had been erected near the great oak that had witnessed countless such gatherings. Already people were arriving, farmers looking for strong backs, merchants seeking guards for their caravans, and wealthy households in need of protection or skilled labor. Signe arrived early, positioning herself where she could observe both, the platform and the other bidders. The ironclad brothers were there, of course, with purses heavy enough to outbid most competitors. Several other prominent families had sent representatives, and there, near the back, stood figures she didn't recognize, possibly traders from other villages, drawn by word of particularly valuable offerings. The auctioneer, a barrel-chested man named Thorvald, called the crowd to order as the first. Warrior was brought forward, young, lean, with the quick eyes of a scout. The bidding was spirited, but not excessive. He sold for 22 silver pieces to a merchant who needed someone to watch his warehouses. One by one, the warriors were presented and sold. Most went quickly, their prices reasonable. Signe watched the patterns, learning how the crowd responded to different types of fighters. The young ones sparked interest from multiple bidders. The older, more experienced warriors commanded higher prices, but drew fewer competitors. Most people preferred the potential of youth to the proven skill of age. As the auction progressed, she noticed something interesting. Several times, promising. Warriors were passed over by bidders who seemed to recognize something about them that she couldn't discern. A sword scar along a particular angle, a tattoo that marked clan affiliation, small signs that spoke of histories she couldn't read. Then, Thorvald's voice boomed across the square. "And now, our final offering. Some of you know this name, though he's been absent from our shores for many seasons." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Signe felt the energy change. People leaned forward, whispered to their neighbors, and she saw several bidders suddenly look uncertain. "Fenrik Ironhowl," Thorvald announced, late of the northern campaigns, veteran of more battles than most men see summers. The man who stepped onto the platform was enormous, easily the largest person Signe had ever seen. Broad shoulders strained against the simple tunic provided to auction subjects, and dark hair hung past his collar, partially obscuring features that looked like they'd been carved from granite by an angry god. Scars marked his visible skin, not the random marks of accident or misfortune, but the deliberate patterns of countless battles. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. Despite his fearsome appearance, despite the way the crowd suddenly grew quiet and wary, there was something in his gaze that didn't match the rest of him. When those dark eyes swept across the gathered people, they seemed tired rather than threatening. Sad, almost. "Bidding starts at 15 silver, Thorvald announced. Silence. Signe looked around in amazement. Here was clearly the most formidable warrior of the day, and no one was raising their hand. The reason became clear as conversations resumed in hushed tones around her. "Berserker, they say. Madness takes them in battle. Killed his own men once during the rage. Can't be trusted when the fury comes." She studied Fenrik more carefully. Berserker. That explained the crowd's reluctance. The chateau. Berserkers were legendary warriors who fought with supernatural fury, feeling no pain, knowing no fear. But they were also unpredictable, prone to battle madness that could turn them against friend as easily as foe. Most people considered them too dangerous for household service. 12 silver, Thorvald called, lowering the starting bid. Still nothing. 10 silver for this proven warrior, the auctioneer tried, beginning to sound desperate. Signe's heart was racing. 10 silver pieces for a fighter whose very presence made hardened warriors nervous. It was either the opportunity of a lifetime or the worst mistake she could possibly make. She watched Fenrik's face as the bidding failed to materialize. There was no anger there, no disappointment, just a sort of weary acceptance, as if he'd expected this outcome. For a moment their eyes met across the crowd, and something passed. Between them, recognition perhaps, though she was certain they'd never spoken. 5 silver, Thorvald called, his voice strained. Surely someone. Signe's hand rose before she could think better of it. The square fell silent. Every head turned toward her, and she felt the weight of their stares like physical pressure. Somewhere in the crowd she heard a woman gasp. Near the platform, the ironclad brothers were staring at her with expressions of astonishment and calculation. 5 silver to the healer, Thorvald said, sounding relieved to have any bid at all. Do I hear 6? The silence stretched. No one else raised their hand. 5 silver once, Thorvald called. 5 silver twice. Sold to Signe Eriksdottir for 5 silver pieces. As she walked forward to complete the transaction, Signe was acutely aware of the conversations exploding around her. Some people sounded shocked, others worried, and a few seemed almost amused by what they clearly saw as a catastrophic mistake. She handed over her silver and received the traditional token, a small piece of carved bone that would serve as proof of ownership until formal papers could be prepared. When she looked up at Fenrik, she found him studying her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You know what you've purchased?" he asked quietly, his voice deeper than she'd expected but gentler somehow. "A protector," she said, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. Something that might have been surprise flickered across his features. "And you're not afraid?" Signe considered the question seriously. She was afraid. Terrified, actually. But not of him, she realized. She was afraid of making the wrong choice, of being weak when strength was required, of failing to protect what Magnus had built. But looking at this giant of a man, seeing the careful way he held himself despite his obvious power, she felt something unexpected. Hope. "No," she said finally. "I don't think I am." For the first time since stepping onto the platform, Fenrik Ironhowl smiled. It transformed his entire face, turning the harsh angles soft and making him look almost approachable, almost human. "Then we should go home," he said simply. As they walked away from the square together, Signe was aware of every whisper, every stare, every shake of a disapproving head. But she was also aware of something else, the way people stepped aside when they saw Fenrik coming, the way conversations stopped mid-sentence when he passed, the way even the ironclad brothers watched with cautious respect rather than the predatory interest they'd shown before. Whatever else she'd purchased today, she'd bought herself time. Time to figure out her next move, time to strengthen her position, time to prove that Magnus's widow was not as vulnerable as everyone assumed. Whether she'd also bought herself safety remained to be seen. The walk from the village square to Signe's home passed in relative silence, broken only by the crunch of frost-hardened earth beneath their feet and the distant sound of the crowd dispersing behind them. Signe found herself acutely aware of the man walking beside her, his measured pace deliberately shortened to match hers, the way he positioned himself slightly behind and to her left, creating a subtle barrier between her and anyone who might approach from the road. She clutched the carved bone token in her palm, its surface already warming from her grip, such a small thing to represent such a monumental change. This morning, she'd awakened alone and vulnerable. Now, she walked home with a giant Viking berserker, whose reputation preceded him like thunder before a storm. "The silver coin," Fenrik said suddenly, his deep voice startling her from her thoughts. "The one you raised at the auction. May I see it?" Confused but curious, Signe reached into her pouch and withdrew the bidding coin, a simple disc of silver, unremarkable, except for the small dent near one edge, where Magnus had once dropped it on stone. She held it out to Fenrik, watching as he studied it with an intensity that seemed far greater than the object warranted. "I thought so," he murmured, his thumb tracing the dented edge. "Magnus carried this coin for 15 years. Won it in a game of bones from a trader who claimed it was lucky." Signe stared at him. "You knew my husband. We served together briefly in the Eastern campaigns, before he settled down, before he chose the quiet life." Fenrik handed the coin back to her, his fingers careful not to brush hers. "He was a good man, fair in his dealings, loyal to his friends." "You never spoke to me before," she said, studying his profile as they continued walking. "In all the years since you both returned, I never saw you in the village." "No," Fenrik agreed quietly. "You wouldn't have." There was something in his tone that suggested more to the story, but before Signe could pursue it, they reached the stone marker that indicated the boundary of her property. Her home sat nestled in a small valley, protected on 3 sides by gentle hills and opening to the south where Magnus had cleared fields for barley and rye. It wasn't the largest holding in the area, but it was fertile and well-positioned, with fresh water from a stream that never ran dry. "This is it," she said, suddenly seeing her home through a stranger's eyes. The house itself was modest but well-built, with thick stone walls and a properly thatched roof. The barn and outbuildings showed Magnus's careful maintenance, though some tasks had gone undone since his death. The fields were bare now, with winter approaching, but come spring they would need ploughing and planting. Fenrik surveyed the property, with the practiced eye of someone who understood both its value and its vulnerabilities. "Good land," he said finally. "I can see why others might covet it." As they approached the house, Signe felt the weight of the decision she'd made settling over her like a heavy cloak. She'd purchased a man's service, temporary ownership of another human being. The concept had always made her uncomfortable, even though it was common practice and generally considered more humane than slavery. At least the purchased warriors retained their essential dignity and the promise of eventual freedom. But what did one do with a purchased berserker? How did one house a man whose very presence had silenced an entire auction crowd? "There's a room above the stable," she said hesitantly as they reached the front door. "It's clean and warm, with a good window for light. I thought that would be fine," Fenrik interrupted gently. "Thank you." His easy acceptance of what was essentially servants' quarters surprised her. She'd expected some negotiation, some discussion of terms and expectations. Instead, he simply nodded and waited for her to lead the way. The stable was built against the north side of the house, sharing a wall for warmth. Magnus had designed it to hold 4 horses, though they'd never owned more than 2. Above the stalls, a ladder led to a loft space that had served as storage and occasional guest quarters. Signe climbed up first, Fenrik following with surprising grace for such a large man. The room was indeed clean and comfortable, with a proper bed, a small table, and a window that looked out over the southern fields. Magnus had used it sometimes, when the weather was too harsh for traveling patients to return home immediately. "The house is warmer," Signe said, suddenly feeling the need to explain, "but I thought you might prefer privacy." "You thought correctly," Fenrik said, setting down the small pack that contained his few possessions. "And it's better this way. Safer for both of us." "Safer?" He turned to face her, and for a moment she saw something flicker in his dark eyes. Pain, perhaps, or old regret. People fear what they don't understand. A berserker in your house would give them more reason to whisper, more cause to question your judgment. This way, I'm close enough to protect you, but distant enough to preserve your reputation. The thoughtfulness of his reasoning surprised her again. This was not the mindless killing machine the auction crowd had feared, but a man who understood social dynamics and cared about consequences. "About that," she said carefully, "the berserker rage. Should I be concerned?" Fenrik was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the gathering dusk. When he spoke, his voice was soft but clear. "I haven't felt the fury in 3 years. Not since the battle at Crow's Ridge, when I watched good men die because I couldn't control what I became." He turned back to her, his expression serious. "I can't promise it will never return. The rage is like a wolf that sleeps lightly. It might wake if the right threat presents itself. But I can promise you this: I would die before I let it turn on you." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Whatever demons Fenrik carried, whatever battles he'd fought with his own nature, she believed he meant every word. "Thank you," she said simply, "for being honest with me." As she turned to leave, Fenrik spoke again. "Signe." The sound of her name in his deep voice made her pause. "Why did you bid on me? Truth, please. Not the answer you gave the crowd." She considered lying, giving him some practical explanation about needing the most intimidating protector she could afford. But something in his manner demanded honesty. "Your eyes," she said finally. "When you looked at the crowd when no one was bidding, you weren't angry, you weren't resentful, you looked resigned, sad maybe, like a man who'd accepted disappointment so many times that hope had become a luxury you couldn't afford." She met his gaze directly. "I know that look. I've worn it myself these past months." Fenrik stared at her for a long moment, and she thought she saw surprise in his expression. Perhaps no one had ever looked closely enough to see past his fearsome reputation to the man beneath. "I'll earn your trust," he said quietly. "Whatever you paid for me, I'll prove it was well spent." "You already have," Signe replied, though she wasn't entirely sure why she felt that way. As she made her way back to the house, Signe found herself thinking about the day's events with a mixture of amazement and trepidation. This morning she'd been a vulnerable widow with limited options and dangerous enemies. Tonight she was the owner of the most feared warrior in the region, a man whose very presence had already begun to change how others looked at her. But more than that, she'd glimpsed something in Fenrik that intrigued her, a complexity that belied his simple reputation. There were layers to this man, stories behind the scars, reasons for the careful way he held himself apart from the world. Inside her house, she moved through the familiar evening routine of banking the fire and securing the doors. But tonight, felt different. Tonight, for the first time in months, she didn't check each window twice or start at every sound from outside. Tonight, she knew that someone was watching over her property, someone whose strength and skill were beyond question. As she prepared for bed, Signe found herself looking toward the stable, where a faint light glowed in the window above. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, questions from neighbors, possibly hostile reactions from those who disapproved of her choice, the practical matters of integrating a warrior into her quiet household. But tonight, wrapped in the strange comfort of knowing she was no longer alone, Signe slept better than she had since Magnus died. And in the stable loft, Fenrik Ironhowl sat by his window, watching the approaches to her land with the patience of a man who had finally found something worth protecting. The silver coin that had sealed their arrangement caught the moonlight, from where Signe had placed it on her bedside table, such a small thing to change the course of two lives. But sometimes the most significant moments came disguised as simple choices, and sometimes the heart knew what the mind had yet to understand. Tomorrow would reveal whether Signe's impulsive decision had been wisdom or folly. But tonight, the widow and the berserker slept safely under the same stars, their fates now intertwined by the ancient ritual of silver changing hands and promises made in the shadow of necessity. Dawn came with the sound of splitting wood, rhythmic and precise. Signe woke gradually, the unfamiliar noise pulling her from dreams filled with silver coins and dark eyes. For a moment she lay still, disoriented by the sound that had no place in her usual morning routine. Then memory flooded back. The auction, the giant warrior, the choice that had changed everything. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Fenrik behind the house, his massive frame moving with surprising grace as he worked. A pile of split logs grew steadily beside him, each piece cut to the perfect size for her fireplace. His battle axe, a weapon that had seemed so menacing at the auction, moved through the wood like it was crafted for this domestic purpose rather than warfare. The axe itself was a thing of brutal beauty. Its double-edged head gleamed despite its obvious age, and the long handle was worn smooth by countless hands. Intricate knotwork had been carved into the metal, and Signe could see faint traces of runes near the base of each blade. This was no common weapon, but something forged with care and meant to last generations. "Good morning," she called softly, not wanting to startle him. Fenrik straightened, setting the axe aside with careful precision. "I hope the noise didn't wake you. Your woodpile was running low and winter's coming fast." It was true. Chopping wood had been one of the tasks she'd been dreading as the cold months approached. Magnus had always handled such work, and she'd been uncertain how to manage it alone. Yet here was Fenrik, solving the problem before she'd even asked. "Thank you," she said, studying the neat stack of split logs. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." His tone was matter-of-fact, without resentment. "You purchased my service. That means ensuring your comfort and safety in all things." Something in his phrasing bothered her, though she couldn't immediately identify what. As she prepared breakfast, porridge, with dried berries and honey, she found herself glancing out the window to where Fenrik continued his work. He moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to physical labor, but there was something almost meditative about his actions, as if the repetitive motion brought him peace. When she called him in to eat, he hesitated at the threshold. "The kitchen table is fine," she said, anticipating his concern. "No one can see through these windows." He nodded and entered, but she noticed how carefully he positioned himself, close enough to the door for quick exit, angled so he could see both, the main entrance and the window that faced the road. Even at breakfast, he remained alert to potential threats. They ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional comment about the weather or the quality of the harvest. But Signe found herself watching him, noting small details that contradicted his fearsome reputation, the way he held his spoon with surprising delicacy, How he chewed slowly, savoring food that was probably far better than military rations, but hardly luxurious. The careful way he wiped his mouth with the cloth she'd provided. "You have questions," he said, without looking up from his bowl. "Many," she admitted, "but I'm not sure which ones I should ask." That earned her a small smile. "Ask what you need to know to feel safe. Everything else can wait." "The berserker rage," she said, deciding on directness. "You said you haven't felt it in 3 years, but if it returned, would there be warning? Signs I should watch for?" Fenrik set down his spoon and considered the question seriously. "Usually, yes, the fury doesn't simply appear. It builds like a storm. First comes the heat in my chest, then the roaring in my ears. My vision changes, narrows to focus only on threats. If you ever see me begin to shake, or if my breathing becomes labored, when there's no physical cause, leave. Immediately. Don't try to speak to me or bring me back. Just go." The clinical way he described his own potential loss of control was somehow more reassuring than any promise that it wouldn't happen. This was a man who understood his condition and had thought carefully about how to manage it. "Has anyone ever been able to stop it once it starts?" "Once," he said quietly, "but she's dead now." Before Signe could ask more, a knock at the door interrupted them. Fenrik was on his feet instantly, his entire posture shifting from relaxed to predatory in the space of a heartbeat. He held up one hand, silently instructing her to stay seated, and approached the door with steps that made no sound despite his size. "Signe," came a familiar voice. "It's Bjorn." Fenrik glanced back at her and she nodded. "Astrid's grandson. He's safe." But when Fenrik opened the door, Bjorn's expression showed he felt anything but safe. His eyes widened at the sight of the giant warrior, and he took an involuntary step backward. "I came to check on you," Bjorn managed, his voice slightly strained. "After yesterday, people are talking." "Come in," Signe said, rising from the table. "Fenrik, this is Bjorn." "Bjorn, meet Fenrik Ironhowl." The two men studied each other with the wariness of wolves establishing territory. Bjorn was no weakling. He stood tall and carried himself like someone accustomed to physical work. But next to Fenrik, he looked like a boy. Still, he didn't back down, and Signe saw a flicker of approval in Fenrik's eyes. "The village is concerned," Bjorn said, addressing Signe but keeping one eye on Fenrik. "Some people think you've made a dangerous mistake." "And what do you think?" Signe asked. Bjorn was quiet for a moment, studying Fenrik with the careful attention of someone whose survival might depend on reading people correctly. "I think," he said slowly, "that you look less worried than you have in months, and I think anyone planning to trouble you will have to reconsider their plans." "Wise young man," Fenrik said, speaking for the first time since the introductions. His tone held a note of respect that seemed to surprise Bjorn. "There's something else," Bjorn continued, relaxing slightly. "The ironclad brothers sent word this morning they want to meet with you, today if possible. They say it's about mutual interests regarding your land." Signe felt her stomach tighten. She'd expected this, but not so soon. "Where?" "The tavern, midday." Bjorn hesitated. "Signe. They brought extra men with them, fighters I don't recognize. Whatever they want to discuss, they're prepared for resistance." Fenrik's expression grew thoughtful. "How many men?" "6, maybe 7, all armed, all looking like they know how to use their weapons." "Good," Fenrik said, surprising both Signe and Bjorn. At their questioning looks, he explained, if they felt confident about their position, they wouldn't need so many swords. The fact that they're worried enough to bring reinforcements tells us they're not as strong as they want to appear. Signe found his logic both reassuring and terrifying. The idea that the ironclad brothers were concerned enough about her new protector to arm themselves heavily was flattering in a way, but it also meant the situation was escalating faster than she'd hoped. "I'll go," she decided, "but not alone." "Agreed," Fenrik said, "though we should discuss strategy first." After Bjorn left with promises to carry word of the meeting's acceptance, Signe found herself pacing the kitchen, while Fenrik sat calmly at the table, apparently lost in thought. "They want to intimidate me," she said, working through her fears aloud. "Surround me with armed men and make me feel helpless." "Probably," Fenrik agreed. "But intimidation only works if the target feels genuinely threatened. You won't." His confidence was infectious, and Signe felt some of her anxiety ease. For the first time since Magnus's death, she wasn't facing her enemies alone. The wooden gate to Signe's herb garden had been Magnus's last project before his illness took hold. He'd carved intricate patterns into the oak panels, intertwining vines and leaves that seemed to dance in the changing light. The gate served as both practical barrier and symbolic threshold, separating her healing sanctuary from the wider world, where dangers lurked. Now, as midday approached and the meeting with the ironclad brothers drew near, Signe found herself standing beside that gate with Fenrik, discussing strategy in the crisp autumn air. The herb garden beyond was mostly dormant now, the summer's bounty dried and stored for winter use, but the space still emanated the peace she'd always found among her healing plants. "Tell me about them," Fenrik said, his voice low and thoughtful. "Not their reputations, their personalities, how they think, how they react under pressure." Signe considered the question, remembering years of observing the brothers at village gatherings and trade meetings. Ulf is the elder and more cunning. He prefers manipulation to direct confrontation, likes to make people feel indebted to him. Erik is more straightforward, quicker to anger, more likely to use intimidation when subtlety fails. And they work well together. Usually, Ulf plans, Erik executes, but Erik sometimes acts without thinking when he feels slighted, and that creates tensions between them. Fenrik nodded, absorbing this information with the careful attention of someone accustomed to turning knowledge into tactical advantage. Good. Divided opponents make mistakes. What about their followers, hired swords or men bound by loyalty? A mixture, I think. Some have served them for years, but the new faces suggest they've been recruiting recently. Signe paused, struck by a troubling thought. "Fenrik, what if they simply want to negotiate? What if I'm overreacting? Then we'll know within the first minute," he replied calmly. "Men who come to negotiate in good faith don't bring 7 armed companions to intimidate. Unwidow, they're planning something and it won't be in your favor." As they walked toward the village, Signe found herself studying Fenrik's preparations for the confrontation. He'd cleaned and sharpened his axe until it gleamed, but he carried it casually, as if it were merely a walking stick. His movements remained relaxed, unhurried, giving no sign of the alertness she could sense beneath the surface. "Aren't you nervous?" she asked. "No," he said simply. "Nervous is what you feel when the outcome matters, but remains uncertain. I know how this will end." His confidence was both reassuring and slightly unsettling. There was something in his tone that suggested he'd faced similar situations many times before, always with the same result. The tavern sat at the heart of the village, a substantial building of stone and timber that had served as unofficial meeting place for generations. As they approached, Signe could see horses tied outside, more than usual for midday, confirming that the ironclad brothers had indeed brought additional men. "Stay close," Fenrik murmured as they reached the door, "but not so close that you can't move freely if things turn violent. And remember, you're not supplicating, you're granting them an audience." The tavern's main room was darker than the autumn sunshine outside, lit by flickering oil lamps and the glow from the central hearth. Most of the usual patrons had found reasons to be elsewhere, leaving only a handful of locals nursing their ails with carefully neutral expressions. The ironclad brothers had claimed the large table near the back wall, positioning themselves so they could see both the main entrance and the rear exit. Ulf sat in the center, his graying hair neatly braided and his clothes proclaiming his wealth without ostentation. Erik flanked him to the right, younger and bulkier, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. Around them, arranged with obvious Intent sat 6 other men. All were armed, all watched the door with predatory attention, and all wore the confident expressions of fighters who expected easy work. That confidence wavered when Fenrik filled the doorway. Signe watched the dynamic shift in the space of a heartbeat. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Hands moved unconsciously toward weapons before their owners caught themselves. Even Ulf, practiced in maintaining composure, showed a flicker of surprise at the sheer physical presence of the man accompanying her. Signe, Ulf said, rising with practiced courtesy, while his eyes remained fixed on Fenrik. "Thank you for coming. I trust you're well." "Well enough," she replied, taking the seat across from him. Fenrik positioned himself slightly behind and to her left, close enough to act if needed, but far enough away to avoid seeming overtly threatening. The irony wasn't lost on her. A berserker trying not to seem threatening. "We were sorry to hear." "About Magnus," Eric said, his tone suggesting polite concern rather than genuine sympathy. "He was a good man, if set in his ways." "He was," Signe agreed neutrally, waiting for them to reveal their true purpose. Ulf leaned forward slightly, his manner becoming more businesslike. "We've been thinking about your situation. A woman alone, trying to manage a substantial holding. It must be difficult," I manage. Of course, but winter's coming and there will be challenges. The spring planting alone requires more labor than one person can provide." Ulf's smile was warm and seemingly genuine. "We'd like to help." "How?" "Generous," Signe said carefully. "We're prepared to make you a very fair offer for your land," Eric interjected, apparently growing impatient with his brother's approach. "Enough silver to buy a comfortable house in the village proper, with funds left over for your future needs. There." It was the real reason for this meeting. Signe kept her expression neutral while her mind raced. "And what would you do with my land?" "Combine it with our existing holdings," Ulf said smoothly. "Create a more efficient operation. Better for everyone involved, including me, presumably, especially you. No more worrying about harvests or repairs or protection. You could focus on your healing practice without the burden of property management." Signe noticed how carefully they'd choreographed this conversation. Ulf presented the reasonable arguments while Eric provided subtle pressure. The armed men remained silent but visible, their presence adding weight to the unspoken suggestion that refusal might have consequences. "It's a generous offer," she said, finally, "but I'm not ready to sell." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Eric's hand moved closer to his sword hilt, and several of the hired men shifted in their seats. "Perhaps you should reconsider," Eric said, his voice carrying a harder edge. "A woman in your position. Accidents happen, especially when someone doesn't have proper protection." It was Fenrik who responded, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet room. "She has protection." The words were spoken softly, almost conversationally, but something in their delivery made every armed man in the tavern tense. Signe realized this was the first time most of them had heard the legendary berserker speak, and his calm certainty was somehow more unsettling than any display of rage would have been. "Ah, yes," Ulf said, recovering his composure. "Your recent acquisition. Tell me, Signe, do you really trust your safety to a man whose own reputation suggests he's as dangerous to friends as enemies?" "I trust him more than I trust people who bring armed men to discuss mutual interests," Signe replied evenly. The confrontation was escalating exactly as Fenrik had predicted, but Signe found herself feeling oddly calm. Perhaps it was his presence behind her, or perhaps it was simply the relief of finally having the threat stated openly rather than hidden behind polite words. "Think carefully about our offer," Ulf said, rising from his seat. The movement was clearly a signal. His men began standing as well, their hands now openly resting on weapon hilts. Winter is a dangerous time for those without friends. As the ironclad brothers and their followers filed out of the tavern, Signe, remained seated until the last of them had passed through the door. Only then did she allow herself to breathe normally again. "Well," she said quietly, "that could have gone worse." "It will," Fenrik replied grimly. "That was just the opening. Move." 3 days after the tavern confrontation, Signe found herself staring at Magnus's sword where it lay across their old marriage chest, afternoon sunlight streaming through the bedroom window to illuminate the worn leather of its scabbard. She'd avoided this task for months, but Fenrik's presence in her life had stirred something, a need to finally sort through the remnants of her past before she could properly face her future. The sword itself was unremarkable by warrior standards, well made but practical, its blade showing the careful maintenance of a man who understood that his life might depend on its sharpness. Magnus had been a competent fighter in his youth, though never one to seek glory in battle. The weapon represented his younger, more adventurous days, before marriage and farming had claimed his attention. Now it felt like an accusation, a reminder of how defenseless his death had left her. "You don't have to do this alone," Fenrik said. From the doorway, his voice gentle but carrying that ever-present undertone of alertness, she turned to find him watching her with an expression of careful concern. Over the past few days, they'd settled into an easy routine. He handled the physical demands of maintaining the property while she tended to her healing practice and the domestic tasks that kept their small household running. But there remained an underlying tension, unspoken questions that circled between them like cautious birds. "I've been putting this off for too long," she said, lifting Magnus's sword and feeling its familiar weight. "It's time to decide what stays and what goes." Fenrik entered the room slowly, his movements deliberately unthreatening despite his size. "He was a good man. Bjorn mentioned that several times when he spoke of your marriage." "He was," Signe agreed, settling onto the edge of the bed with the sword across her knees. "Patient, kind, steady as mountain stone. He deserved better than dying in his sleep from a fever no amount of healing could touch." "Death rarely comes when we're ready for it," Fenrik said, taking a seat on the wooden stool near the window. The furniture creaked under his weight but held, or to those who least deserve it. Something in his tone suggested personal experience with unwelcome loss. Signe found herself studying his profile as he gazed out at the southern fields, noting the way his jaw tightened slightly when he thought she wasn't looking. "You mentioned someone once," she said carefully. "Someone who could stop your berserker rage. What happened to her?" For a long moment, Fenrik was silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "Her name was Astrid. Not your friend's grandmother, a different woman entirely. She was a shield maiden, fought alongside our war band in the northern campaigns, strong enough to match any man in battle, wise enough to see the person beneath the fury. You loved her." "I did, more than I thought possible." He turned from the window to meet Signe's eyes. "The first time the berserker rage took me in her presence, she didn't run. She stood her ground, spoke my name until the red mist cleared, said she could see my soul even when I couldn't find it myself." "What happened?" Fenrik's expression grew distant, painful. "Crow's Ridge. The battle I mentioned before. We were outnumbered, desperate. I felt the fury building and tried to warn her to stay clear, but the enemy broke through our lines. She moved to protect the wounded, and I—" He stopped, his hands clenching into fists. "When the rage took me, I lost track of everything except the need to kill. When it finally passed, I found her body among the enemy dead. My axe—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Signe understood. The thing he'd feared most had come to pass. His own weapon had taken the life of the woman he loved. "I'm sorry," she said, the words feeling inadequate for such a profound loss. "So am I. Every day since." Fenrik met her gaze directly. "That's why I left the warbands. Why I avoid close attachments. Why I was honest with you about the risks." The weight of his confession settled between them, adding new layers to their already complex relationship. Signe found herself thinking about the careful way he positioned himself around her, the deliberate distance he maintained even as he fulfilled his protective duties. She'd attributed it to respect for her widowhood, but now she understood it differently. "You're afraid," she said softly. "Terrified," he admitted without shame. "Not of dying, death holds no fear for a warrior, but of becoming a monster again, of hurting someone who doesn't deserve it." Signe set Magnus's sword aside and moved to sit closer to Fenrik, noting how he tensed slightly at her approach, but didn't retreat. "Have you felt it since you've been here? The rage? No, but then we haven't faced real danger yet. The tavern was posturing, threats disguised as conversation. When actual violence comes, and it will come, I don't know how I'll react." "I do," Signe said with quiet certainty. "You'll protect what needs protecting, and control what needs controlling, because that's who you are." Fenrik looked at her with surprise, as if her confidence in him was unexpected. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've watched you these past days. I've seen how you move around this house, always careful, always aware of your own strength. I've seen you split wood with an axe that could cleave a man in two, and I've seen you handle my dishes like they were made of spun glass." She touched his arm lightly, feeling the muscle tense beneath her fingers. A true monster wouldn't care about such things. For a moment, something shifted in Fenrik's expression. Hope, perhaps, or the beginning of forgiveness for past sins. But before either of them could explore the moment further, a sound from outside drew their attention. Horses, multiple riders approaching at speed. Fenrik was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with practiced efficiency. 6 riders, he reported, his voice all business now. "Armed and moving with purpose. Not the ironclad brothers. I don't recognize these men." Signe joined him at the window, her heart sinking as she saw the approaching riders. They wore no identifying colors, but their equipment and bearing marked them as professional fighters. Mercenaries, most likely, hired to do what the brothers preferred not to do themselves. "They're not here to talk," Fenrik said grimly already, moving toward where his axe rested against the wall. "What do they want? To send a message. Either you accept their offer, or they make your life so unpleasant that you reconsider." He paused in the doorway, his expression serious. "Stay in the house, bar the door behind me, and don't open it for anyone except me or Bjorn." "Fenrik, I know what I'm doing," he said, and for the first time since she'd known him, she heard something in his voice that reminded her of his fearsome reputation. "This is what you purchased, Signe. Let me earn my keep." As he strode toward the front door, Magnus's sword caught Signe's eye, where it still lay across the marriage chest. The weapon that had once protected her now seemed fragile, inadequate. But the man walking away from her, the berserker who feared his own strength but wielded it in her defense, he was protection of an entirely different order. She moved to bar the door as instructed, then positioned herself at the window where she could watch what unfolded in her yard. Whatever came next, she would witness it. She owed Fenrik that much at least. From her position at the window, Signe watched Fenrik emerge from the house with unhurried steps, his battle axe held casually. In one hand, the 6 riders had spread out across her yard in a loose semicircle, clearly intending to intimidate through superior numbers. What they hadn't anticipated was how small their formation would seem when faced with a man whose very presence seemed to fill the entire space. The lead rider, a lean man with scars marking his face and arms, spoke first. "We're looking for the Widow Eriksdottir. We have a message from concerned friends." "She's not receiving visitors," Fenrik replied calmly, positioning himself between the riders and the house. "Perhaps you could leave your message with me," the scarred man laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "I don't think you understand the situation, berserker. This is bigger than one man, no matter how fearsome his reputation." "Is it?" Fenrik asked, and something in his tone made the horses shift nervously beneath their riders. What happened next unfolded with shocking speed. The scarred man made the mistake of reaching for his sword, not to draw it, but simply to rest his hand on the hilt. in a gesture of implied threat. The moment his fingers touched the weapon, Fenrik moved. Signe had never seen anything like it. Despite his size, Fenrik covered the distance to the nearest horse in 3 fluid strides. His axe swept upward in a controlled arc that stopped just short of the rider's throat, the blade's edge close enough to shave whiskers. The horse, sensing the violence in the air, reared and screamed, throwing its rider to the ground. "Now," Fenrik said conversationally, as if he weren't holding a weapon that could decapitate a man with a flick of his wrist, "shall we discuss your message like civilized people?" The remaining 5 riders found themselves in an impossible position. Their companion lay groaning in the dirt, his horse fled toward the road, and the man they'd come to intimidate stood among them with an ease that suggested he could kill them all before they could clear leather. "The lady has received an offer," the scarred man said from the ground, his voice strained but still defiant. "Our employers hope she'll reconsider her refusal, for everyone's sake, and if she doesn't, then accidents might happen. Fires, animals going missing, contaminated wells." The mercenary's smile was ugly. Shame if such a lovely property suffered from poor fortune. Fenrik's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around him. The horses sensed it first, snorting and sidestepping, as their riders fought to control them. Then Signe saw what the animals had detected, a subtle tremor in Fenrik's hands, a tightening around his eyes that spoke of pressure building inside him. "I see," Fenrik said, his voice growing quieter, "and you believe 6 hired swords are sufficient to carry out these accidents?" "6 is enough for 1 man," the leader said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "1 man, yes." Fenrik: "Agreed, but I'm not just 1 man, am I? I'm the berserker who held the bridge at Thornwick against 30. I'm the warrior who cut through the Raven clan's shield wall like it was made of straw. I'm the man whose name mothers used to frighten children into obedience." With each word, the tremor in his hands grew more pronounced. Signe could see the internal battle he was fighting, the effort to maintain control while using his reputation as a weapon. "More importantly," Fenrik continued, stepping closer to the mounted riders, "I'm the man who loves the woman in that house. And love, my friends, is far more dangerous than rage." The words hit Signe like a physical blow. From her position at the window, she saw the truth written plainly across Fenrik's face as he spoke. This wasn't tactical misdirection or strategic intimidation. It was simple honesty, delivered in the heat of confrontation. He loved her. The scarred mercenary scrambled to his feet, backing toward his companions with obvious haste. "This isn't over, berserker. Our employers have deep pockets and long memories." "Then let me give them something to remember," Fenrik said. In one fluid motion, he spun and hurled his axe at the massive oak tree that stood at the edge of Signe's property. The weapon flew end over end, covering 30 yards before embedding itself in the trunk with a sound like thunder. The tree shuddered from the impact, and leaves rained down like snow. The message was unmistakable. The axe hadn't been thrown to show off. It had been thrown to demonstrate exactly how far Fenrik could kill a man with pinpoint accuracy. "Tell your employers," Fenrik said as the mercenaries began their hasty retreat, "that the next time they send representatives to this house, those representatives should come prepared to die. Because I am." The riders departed at speed, leaving only dust and the memory of barely controlled violence hanging in the air. Signe watched Fenrik walk to the oak tree and work his axe free from the trunk, noting how his hands still trembled slightly with the after-effects of his internal struggle. When he returned to the house, she was waiting by the door. Neither of them spoke immediately. The weight of what had just happened and what had been revealed filled the space between them like smoke from a great fire. "You felt it," she said finally. "The rage. I could see it building." "Yes," he admitted, setting his axe aside with careful precision. "But I controlled it, used it instead of being used by it, because of what you said about love." She stepped closer, studying his face. "Did you mean it?" Fenrik was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching hers. "I've loved you for years," he said finally. "Since before you married Magnus, since before I understood what love truly meant. When I saw you at the market that first time, saw the way you tended a sick child with such gentle care, it was like watching the sun rise for the first time. Why didn't you ever? Because you belonged to another man, a good man who deserved your loyalty." His voice grew soft with old pain. "Because I was a berserker with blood on his hands and darkness in his heart. Because you deserved better than a man who might lose control and hurt you." Signe reached up to touch his face, feeling the tremor that still ran through him. "And now? Now you're in danger because of choices I helped you make. Now those threats extend to you because of my presence in your life. Now I have to ask myself if my love is protecting you or endangering you." "That's not your choice to make," she said firmly. "It's mine, and I choose." Before she could finish the sentence, they heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Bjorn appeared around the corner of the house, moving at a run, his face flushed with exertion and concern. "Signe," he called, "thank the gods you're safe. We saw the riders from the village. Are you hurt?" "We're fine," she said, though she didn't step away from Fenrik. "They delivered their message and left." Bjorn's eyes moved between them, taking in their proximity, the lingering tension in the air, the way they stood together like partners rather than mistress and servant. Understanding dawned on his face, followed quickly by something that looked like approval. "Good," he said simply, "because there's something else you need to know. The iron-clad brothers left the village this morning with a larger force. 20. Men, maybe more. They're not planning to negotiate anymore." As the implications of this news settled over them, Signe felt Fenrik's hand find hers. His fingers were warm, strong, and still trembling slightly from the confrontation, but they were steady enough to hold on to. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The letter arrived with the dawn, delivered by a boy too young to understand the significance of what he carried. Signe found it slipped beneath her door while Fenrik was checking the perimeter of the property, a routine he'd established since the mercenary's visit 3 days prior. The parchment was sealed with black wax, unmarked by any identifying symbol, but something about its very presence made her hands shake as she broke it open. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, and completely unfamiliar. "Your husband did not die of fever. The symptoms you observed, the sudden onset, the way his body fought against your remedies, the peculiar pallor that preceded his death, these were not natural. Magnus was poisoned, slowly and deliberately, over the course of several weeks. The herb that killed him grows in your own garden. Someone with access to your home, someone you trusted, administered small doses until his body could no longer fight the accumulated toxins. Look for yourself. Check the roots of the monkshood near your back gate. See how recently they've been harvested. Ask yourself who knew enough about healing to disguise murder as sickness. Ask yourself who benefits most from your widowhood. A friend who seeks justice." Tut! Letter fell from Signe's nerveless fingers, landing on the kitchen floor like a fallen leaf. For a moment the world seemed to tilt around her, reality reshaping itself into something darker and more terrible than she'd ever imagined. Magnus hadn't died from natural causes. Someone had murdered him. Her legs gave out, and she found herself sitting heavily on the wooden bench beside her table, staring at the letter as if it might transform into something less horrifying. But the words remained, black ink on pale parchment, spelling out a truth that explained so many things she'd tried not to question. The way Magnus's illness had come on so gradually that she'd attributed it to age and winter's approach. The strange way his body had rejected remedies that should have helped, as if something was working against her efforts to heal him. The peculiar symptoms that hadn't quite matched any fever she'd encountered in years of healing practice. She'd blamed herself for months, convinced that her skills had failed when they were needed most. But if this letter spoke truth, then no amount of healing knowledge could have saved him. Someone had been working against her from the beginning, poisoning him while she tried desperately to cure what she thought was a natural illness, monkshood. The plant grew wild in many places, but she cultivated a small patch near her garden gate for its legitimate medicinal uses. In tiny doses, properly prepared, it could ease certain kinds of pain. In larger amounts, or administered over time, it was a deadly poison that could mimic the symptoms of various illnesses. The sound of Fenrik's returning footsteps broke through her paralysis. She looked up as he entered through the front door, his expression shifting from routine alertness to sharp concern the moment he saw her face. "What's happened?" he asked, crossing to her side in 3 quick strides. Wordlessly, she handed him the letter. She watched his face as he read, saw his jaw tighten and his eyes grow cold with a fury that was entirely different from his berserker rage. This was the controlled anger of a man who understood betrayal and its consequences. "When did this arrive?" he asked, his voice carefully level. "Just now. A village boy brought it." She stood on unsteady legs, needing to move, to do something, with the energy that was building inside her. "Fenrik, if this is true, we need to check the monk's hood first," he said pragmatically. "Verify what can be verified before we consider implications." They walked to the herb garden together, Signe's steps mechanical and strange. The morning air felt different now, tainted with the possibility that her entire understanding of recent events had been built on lies. The gate that Magnus had carved with such care seemed to mock her now, a beautiful barrier that had failed to keep out the real danger. The monk's hood patch was exactly where she'd planted it 3 years ago, tucked into a corner where the roots could spread without interfering with her other herbs, but as they knelt beside the plants, the evidence was unmistakable. Someone had been harvesting from these roots, carefully and knowledgeably, taking just enough to avoid killing the plants, but leaving clear signs of recent disturbance. "This was done by someone who understands herbs," Signe said, her voice hollow. "Someone who knew exactly how much to take and when. Someone with access to your garden," Fenrik added grimly. "Someone you trusted enough to let them come and go freely." The implications crashed over her like a cold wave. How many people had that kind of access? How many possessed the knowledge needed to poison someone slowly, carefully, while maintaining the pretense of friendship or concern? "The Ironclad brothers," she said, grasping for the obvious suspect. "They benefit most from Magnus's death. They want my land." "Neither of them knows enough about healing to pull this off," Fenrik said, shaking his head. "And they're not subtle enough for slow poison. If they wanted Magnus dead, they'd have arranged a hunting accident or a tavern brawl." "Then who?" The question came out as almost a wail, frustration and grief combining into something that threatened to overwhelm her. "Entirely," Fenrik stood slowly, his expression thoughtful and terrible. "Someone who's been close to you throughout this entire process. Someone who was present during Magnus's illness, who had opportunities to administer the poison, who has shown concern for your welfare since his death. That describes half the village," Signe protested, but even as she spoke, her mind was already working through the possibilities. Who had visited frequently during Magnus's final weeks? Who had brought food, offered remedies, expressed sympathy for her struggles? "Not half the village," Fenrik said quietly. "Only those with the knowledge to use monkshood effectively. And, of those, only the ones who would benefit from your current situation." A horrible thought was beginning to form in Signe's mind, but she pushed it away. Not possible. Not someone she'd trusted. Someone who'd shown her nothing but kindness. "There's something else," Fenrik continued, his voice growing grimmer. "Whoever sent this letter, they know details about Magnus's death that weren't common knowledge. The specific symptoms, the way his body rejected treatment. They either witnessed the poisoning or they were involved in it," Signe finished, the full horror of the situation finally becoming clear. "This letter isn't from a friend seeking justice. It's from someone who wants to make sure I know. The truth before what? before the ironclad brothers' final move, before some other catastrophe unfolded? The letter writer's motivations remained unclear, but their knowledge was undeniable. "We need to assume the worst," Fenrik said, scanning the approaches to the house with professional paranoia. "If someone was willing to commit murder once, they'll be willing to do it again. And now that their secret is revealed, they'll act quickly to silence potential witnesses." "But who would—" Signe began, then stopped as a new thought struck her. "Fenrik, you said you suspected something was wrong with Magnus's death. When did you first start to wonder?" His expression grew careful, guarded. "From the beginning. I knew Magnus well enough to recognize when something didn't fit. He was too vital, too healthy to simply waste away from a common fever. But I had no proof, and I was—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I was fighting my own demons at the time. It was easier to tell myself I was imagining things than to pursue suspicions that might lead to uncomfortable truths." "What kind of uncomfortable truths?" "The kind that might force me to choose between justice and the woman I loved," he said simply. "If I'd investigated and discovered the murderer, if I'd brought accusations and demanded justice, what would that have meant for you? Would it have made your life better or worse?" The complexity of his position struck her like a blow. He'd known she was in danger, suspected she was being manipulated, but he'd also known that acting on those suspicions might destroy any chance he had of protecting her from subsequent threats. "You chose to wait," she said, understanding flooding through her. "You let yourself be purchased so you could stay close, so you could protect me from whatever came next." "I chose to be selfish," Fenrik corrected. "I told myself I was being strategic, but the truth is simpler. I wanted to be near you, and I was afraid that seeking justice for Magnus would mean losing that opportunity." Before Signe could respond to this revelation, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Multiple riders, moving fast, coming from the direction of the village. Fenrik's hand moved instinctively to his axe as they both turned toward the road. "Too soon," he muttered. "Whoever sent that letter timed this perfectly." As the riders came into view, more than a dozen armed men, led by figures Signe recognized with a sinking heart. She realized that the letter hadn't been a warning. It had been a signal, a message to flush them out of any sense of security they might have maintained. The ironclad brothers had arrived with their army, and they weren't coming to negotiate. The war horn's deep, resonant call echoed across the valley like the voice of an angry god. Fenrik recognized the sound immediately, not the simple cow horn used for village gatherings, but an actual battle horn carved from the tusk of some great beast. The ironclad brothers weren't just bringing violence to Signe's doorstep. They were announcing it with the formality of a declared war. "Inside," Fenrik commanded, his voice cutting through Signe's paralysis. "Now," but she stood frozen in her herb garden, staring at the approaching force with the stunned comprehension of someone watching their world collapse in real time. More than a dozen riders, just as Bjorn had warned, but now she could see the cold professionalism in their formation. These weren't village toughs or opportunistic mercenaries. These were experienced warriors who knew their business. "Signe," Fenrik said more gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "We need to move. Whatever they're planning, we can't face it in the open." The touch broke her trance, and she allowed him to guide her toward the house. But even as they moved, her mind was racing through the implications of everything that had just been revealed. Magnus murdered, someone she trusted as the killer. And now this perfectly timed arrival of overwhelming force. "It's connected," she said suddenly, stopping just inside the doorway. "The letter, the timing, everything. Whoever killed Magnus, they're orchestrating this." "Probably," Fenrik agreed, already moving to secure the shutters on the windows facing the road. "But right now, we need to focus on surviving the next hour. We can solve murders later." As he worked, Signe found herself studying the interior of her home with new eyes. The thick stone walls that had always provided comfort now seemed like a fortress under siege. The windows that had welcomed morning light now appeared as vulnerabilities through which arrows could fly. The furniture that had held years of peaceful memories was about to witness violence. "What's our strategy?" she asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. Fenrik paused in his preparations to look at her with something that might have been pride. "Our strategy is to make them pay dearly for whatever they think they're going to accomplish. Your house is well built, stone walls, narrow windows, limited approaches. They can't simply overwhelm us with numbers if we're smart about how we defend. And if they decide to burn us out, then we adapt." He moved to the window that faced the yard, peering through a gap in the shutters. "They're taking their time, which means they want to talk first. That gives us opportunities." The war horn sounded again, closer now, and through the shuttered windows they could hear the snorting of horses and the low murmur of men's voices. Fenrik's assessment had been correct. Rather than simply attacking, the force was positioning itself around the property with the deliberate patience of experienced soldiers. "Signe Eriksdottir." Ulf's voice carried clearly across the yard, amplified by authority and confidence. "We've come to discuss terms. Surely we can resolve this matter without unnecessary bloodshed." "He sounds reasonable," Signe said quietly, "almost sincere." "He is sincere," Fenrik replied grimly, "sincerely convinced that he holds all the advantages. Men like Ulf don't bring armies to negotiate, they bring them to dictate terms." Despite his words, Fenrik moved to the front door, keeping his axe ready, but not immediately visible. "What are your terms?" he called back. "Simple enough," came the reply. "The lady signs over her property to us in exchange for safe passage out of the region. She can take whatever personal belongings she can carry, plus enough silver to start a new life elsewhere. And if she refuses—" There was a pause, and when Ulf spoke again, his tone carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Then we'll take the property anyway, and she won't be needing silver for anything." Signe felt something cold settle in her stomach. This wasn't negotiation, it was surrender or death, dressed up in the language of reasonable men. They'd brought overwhelming force specifically to eliminate any possibility of successful resistance. "We need to buy time," she said quietly. "Make them think we're considering their offer while we figure out our real options." "Agreed, but what options do we have?" Fenrik's question was practical, not defeatist. He was thinking like a tactician, evaluating resources and possibilities. 14 men, all armed and experienced. Even if I could take half of them, and that's optimistic, the survivors would still outnumber us significantly. Signe moved through her house, looking at familiar objects with desperate creativity. Healing supplies, household tools, the accumulated possessions of years of quiet life. Nothing that seemed useful against professional killers. Then her gaze fell on Magnus's sword, where it still lay across the marriage chest. "Can you teach me to fight?" she asked suddenly. Fenrik turned from the window, his expression shifting from tactical assessment to something approaching shock. "In the next hour? Signe, swordwork takes years to master properly." "I don't need to master it. I just need to not be helpless." She lifted the sword, feeling its weight differently now, not as a symbol of past protection, but as a tool of present necessity. "You said yourself that numbers matter. If I can hold a blade without cutting myself, that changes the equation slightly." For a moment, Fenrik studied her face with the intensity of someone trying to read the depths of another person's soul. Whatever he saw there seemed to convince him, because he nodded slowly. "Basic guard positions," he said, moving to her side. "How to hold the weapon so you don't drop it, how to block without getting your arm broken, how to strike if an opportunity presents itself." The next few minutes passed in a strange suspension of time. Outside, the warband continued their positioning and preparation. Inside, Fenrik guided Signe through the fundamental concepts of staying alive with a sword in her hand. His instruction was ruthlessly practical. No elegant techniques or graceful forms, just the minimum knowledge needed to avoid being completely defenseless. "Remember," he said, as she practiced a simple overhead block, "your goal isn't to win, sword duels. It's to survive long enough for me to reach you if you get separated, or to buy time if I'm engaged elsewhere." "What about your berserker rage?" she asked, lowering the sword to meet his eyes. "If the fighting becomes desperate enough—" "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been controlling it, using it rather than being consumed by it. But if I think you're going to die—" He shook his head. "I can't predict how I'll react." Outside, Ulf's voice called again. "We're being very patient, but patience has limits. What's your answer?" "We need more time to consider," Fenrik called back, buying them precious minutes to continue their preparations. "Very well, but not much more." As they worked, Signe found herself thinking about the letter again, and the terrible knowledge it had brought. Someone she trusted had murdered Magnus, had orchestrated his slow death while she tried desperately to save him. That same person had likely timed today's revelation to coincide with the ironclad brothers' final move. "Fenrik," she said suddenly, a new thought striking her. "What if the murderer is here? What if they're part of this force, come to make sure? There are no loose ends." His hands stilled on the axe he'd been checking for the dozenth time. "That would make sense. Tie up all the threads, eliminate all the witnesses. But if that's true, then this isn't just about my land anymore," Signe finished. "This is about covering up murder, which means they can't afford to let either of us live, regardless of what we agree to." The realization hit them both at the same time. There would be no negotiation, no terms, no safe passage. The ironclad brothers might believe they were here to claim valuable property, but someone else was using their greed to accomplish a different goal entirely. "They're going to kill us," Signe said, the words coming out with surprising calm. "No matter what we do, no matter what we agree to, we're already dead in their minds." "Then we have nothing to lose by making them pay for it," Fenrik replied. And for the first time since the riders had appeared, he smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a man who'd just been freed from the burden of restraint. The war horn sounded a third time, longer and more insistent than before. Through the gaps in the shutters, they could see movement, as the encircling force tightened their formation. "Time's up!" Ulf called. "What's your decision?" Fenrik looked at Signe, his dark eyes holding a question that went far beyond tactics and strategy. She understood what he was asking, not just whether she was ready to fight, but whether she was ready to trust him completely, to place her life in the hands of a man whose own nature frightened him. "I love you too," she said quietly, answering the question he'd been afraid to ask directly. "Whatever happens, I want you to know that." Something shifted in Fenrik's expression. Relief, perhaps, or the settling of some internal debate that had been raging since the day she'd purchased. "Him!" He moved to the door, his axe now held with obvious intent. "Our decision," he called to the waiting men, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, "is that you can go to hell." The war horn's fourth call was different from the others, sharper, more urgent. It was the signal for attack, and as its echoes faded, the sound of running feet and shouted orders filled the air. The siege of Signe's home had begun. The first attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, coordinated with the precision of men who'd fought together before. Fenrik had positioned his shield, a round piece of iron-banded oak he'd retrieved from the stable, to cover the main window while keeping his axe ready for close combat. Signe crouched behind the heavy wooden table they'd overturned for additional protection, Magnus's sword trembling slightly in her grip. The shield itself was a thing of functional beauty, scarred by countless battles, but still solid and reliable. Its iron boss gleamed in the lamplight, and the leather grip was worn smooth by years of desperate use. Like everything else Fenrik owned, it was a tool made for war, but maintained with the care of a craftsman. "North window," Fenrik said quietly. his voice carrying barely above a whisper. "Two men, they're trying to force the shutters." Signe could hear the scraping of metal against wood as knives worked at the latch mechanisms. The shutters were sturdy, but they'd been designed to keep out weather, not determined attackers. It was only a matter of time before the barriers gave way. "South side," she reported, having been assigned to watch that direction. "I can see movement, but they're staying back, waiting for something." "For the others to break through," Fenrik said grimly. "Standard tactics. Create multiple threats to divide our attention, then exploit whichever opening develops first." A crash from the front of the house announced the first successful breach. The door, solid oak reinforced with iron bands, held against the initial assault, but Signe could see splinters flying as axes bit into the wood. The men outside were working systematically, taking turns to avoid exhaustion while maintaining constant pressure. "How long?" she asked. "Minutes," Fenrik replied, shifting position to face the compromised entrance. "Maybe less." The north window shutters gave way with a sound like breaking bones. Immediately, a bearded face appeared in the opening, eyes scanning the interior for targets. Fenrik's thrown knife took the man in the throat before he could report what he'd seen, but they both knew more would follow. "Stay down," Fenrik commanded, moving toward the window with his shield raised. "No matter what happens, don't expose yourself unnecessarily." But even as he spoke, Signe could see the tactical problem they faced. Every moment Fenrik spent defending one breach was a moment the attackers could use to exploit another. They needed to reduce the number of threats, needed to make the attackers pay such a high price that their numerical advantage became meaningless. "The door's going to fail," she said, watching the steady progress of the axes. "When it does, I'll meet them there," Fenrik said simply. "It's a narrow opening. Only one or two can come through at a time. And the window, you'll have to watch it. If anyone tries to come through, I'll stop them," Signe said with more confidence than she felt. The front door exploded inward with a crash that shook the entire house. Immediately, armed men poured through the opening, but Fenrik was waiting for them. His axe swept in a horizontal arc that caught the first attacker across the chest, sending him crashing back into the men behind him. The narrow doorway that had seemed like a vulnerability became a choke point that limited how many enemies could engage him simultaneously. But even as Fenrik held the entrance, Signe heard the scrape of boots on the windowsill behind her. She turned to see a lean man with cold eyes pulling himself through the north window, a long knife gleaming in his hand. Time seemed to slow as they stared at each other across the interior of her home. The man's expression shifted from surprise to calculation. He'd expected to find her cowering, defenseless, an easy target for a quick killing stroke. Instead, he found her armed and positioned between him and his goal. "Drop the sword, woman," he said conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather. "This doesn't have to be difficult." "You're right," Signe replied, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "It doesn't." She didn't try to fence with him or engage in the kind of skilled swordplay that would have gotten her killed in seconds. Instead, she did exactly what Fenrik had taught her. She used her advantages. The man was halfway through the window, off balance and unable to move freely. She stepped forward and thrust Magnus's sword straight at his center mass, putting her full weight behind the blade. The point took him just below the ribs, sliding between bone and into the soft tissue beyond. His eyes went wide with shock and pain, and the knife fell from suddenly nerveless fingers. He tried to speak, but only blood came out. Signe jerked the sword free and stepped back, her entire body shaking with adrenaline and horror. She'd never killed anyone before, had spent her entire adult life dedicated to healing and preservation of life. But as she watched the man collapse across her windowsill, she felt no regret, only grim satisfaction that one more threat had been eliminated. "Well done!" Fenrik called from the doorway, where 3 bodies now lay tangled in the entrance. His shield showed fresh dents from impacts, and blood, not his own, spattered his arms and chest. "How many more at the window?" "I don't see any," Signe reported, though she kept Magnus's sword ready. The blade was stained now, no longer just a symbol of past protection, but an active instrument of current survival. "They're regrouping," Fenrik said, studying the sudden quiet that had fallen over the attack. Probably didn't expect this much resistance. Through the broken door, Signe could hear urgent voices discussing revised tactics. The easy victory the attackers had anticipated was turning into a costly siege, and their leaders were being forced to reconsider their approach. The temporary lull in the attack lasted just long enough for Signe to understand how much everything had changed. Her hands that had spent years bringing comfort to the sick and injured, were now stained with blood from taking a life. The weight of that knowledge should have broken her, should have sent her collapsing into grief and horror. Instead, she felt something unexpected, a fierce, protective anger that burned away fear and hesitation. These men had come to her home with murder in their hearts. They'd killed Magnus slowly, carefully, and now they wanted to finish what they'd started. "Well, let them try. They're bringing something up," Fenrik observed, peering through the gap where the front door had been. "Torches, I think. They mean to smoke us out." Signe moved to join him, stepping carefully around the bodies that cluttered the entrance. Outside, she could see the remaining attackers gathered around Ulf and Erik, who stood beside a figure she didn't immediately recognize. The third man was tall, lean, with graying hair and clothes that marked him as someone of education rather than a common warrior. "Do you know him?" Fenrik asked, following her gaze. Signe began, then stopped as recognition dawned with horrible clarity. "Yes, that's Thorkel the Wise. He's the closest thing our region has to a learned physician. He's treated patients from half a dozen villages, and I've consulted with him many times over the years." "Your husband's murderer," Fenrik said grimly. The pieces fell into place with sickening precision. Thorkel had been present during Magnus's final illness, had offered advice and remedies that she'd gratefully accepted. He'd known exactly which symptoms to encourage, which treatments to recommend that would worsen rather than improve her husband's condition. And all the while, he'd maintained the perfect facade of concerned colleague, even expressing admiration for her dedication to a hopeless case. "He's been planning this for months," she said, watching as Thorkel pointed toward their house and spoke urgently to the ironclad brothers. "Maybe years, waiting for the right opportunity, the right combination of circumstances. But why? What does he gain from this?" Before Signe could answer, Thorkel's voice carried across the yard with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "Signe Eriksdottir," he called, his tone reasonable and concerned, the same tone he'd used when discussing her husband's failing health. "This has gone far enough. You're wounded, trapped, facing overwhelming odds. Surrender now, and I give you my word that your death will be quick and painless." "Your word," Signe called back, amazed at the steadiness of her own voice. "Like the word you gave when you promised to help heal my husband." There was a pause, and when Thorkel spoke again, she could hear something different in his tone. Satisfaction, perhaps, at finally being able to drop the pretense. "Magnus was dying anyway," he said with clinical detachment. "Age, accumulated injuries, the slow failure that comes to all warriors eventually. I simply expedited the process, made it serve a useful purpose, which was removing an obstacle. Magnus would never have sold this land willingly, would never have allowed it to be developed properly, but a grieving widow, especially one, facing mounting pressures and obvious threats, she might be persuaded to make rational decisions." The casual way he spoke of murder, as if it were simply another medical procedure, made Signe's blood burn with rage. This man had sat at her table, had eaten her food, had accepted her trust and respect while slowly killing the person she'd sworn to protect. "Your mistake," Fenrik said, his voice carrying clearly across the space between them, "was assuming she'd remain helpless." Thorkel's laugh was genuinely amused. "Oh, I made no such assumption. In fact, I counted on her seeking protection. A frightened widow purchases a dangerous warrior. Who could predict such a thing? But berserkers are notoriously unstable, prone to fits of uncontrolled violence. Tragic, really, when such a man turns on his own household in a moment of madness. "Except I won't," Fenrik replied calmly. "Won't you?" Thorkel's voice took on the confident tone of someone revealing a carefully prepared trump card. "Tell me, Fenrik Ironhowl, do you recognize the scent of burning yarrow root, the way it smokes when properly prepared?" Even as he spoke, Signe became aware of a new smell mixing with the smoke from the torches outside. Sweet, cloying, with an undertone that made her head feel light and strange. Fenrik stiffened beside her, his grip tightening on his axe. "What is it?" she asked, though she was already beginning to suspect. "Yarrow root triggers the berserker fury," Fenrik said through gritted teeth, "in men who are susceptible to it. Thorkel's been researching my condition, learning how to weaponize it." The smoke was growing thicker now, drifting through the broken door and shattered windows. Signe could see Fenrik fighting against its effects, could see the tremor beginning in his hands and the way his breathing was becoming labored. "He wants you to lose control," she said, understanding flooding through her. "To become the monster everyone fears, to prove that purchasing you was a fatal mistake." "Yes," Fenrik managed, his voice tight with strain. "And I can feel it working." Outside, Thorkel continued his clinical explanation. "The beauty of this approach is that it solves all our problems at once. The berserker kills the widow in his madness, then we kill the berserker in justified retaliation. 2 inconvenient witnesses eliminated, and the land falls to its rightful owners." Signe moved to stand directly in front of Fenrik, placing her blood-stained hands on either side of his face. His skin was hot to the touch, and she could see the battle raging behind his eyes. "Look at me," she commanded, using the same tone she'd employed with countless patients in crisis. "Not the smoke, not the voices outside. Look at me." Her healing hands, stained now with the blood of enemies, trembled as she felt the heat of his building fury. But they didn't shake with fear, they shook with determination. Just as she'd once fought to save Magnus from poison, she would now fight to save Fenrik from the weapon being used against his own nature. "I'm here," she said, firmly, "and I'm not afraid of you." The new wedding rings were simple bands of silver, forged by the village smith from metal that had once been Signe's bidding coin, the same coin that had bound them together at the auction 6 months ago. They lay now on the wooden table in her kitchen, catching the morning light that streamed through windows, no longer barricaded against attack. The rings represented something that transcended purchase or ownership, a freely chosen bond between equals who had tested their love in fire and found it unbreakable. The battle's end had come with shocking suddenness. When the yarrow smoke had reached its full potency and Fenrik's control finally began to slip, Signe had done something that no one, not Thorkel with all his research, not the ironclad brothers with their carefully laid plans, had anticipated. Instead of fleeing from the berserker fury, she had embraced it. Her healing hands, steady from years of practice, had guided Fenrik's rage like a physician directing the flow of blood or the setting of broken bones. She'd pointed him toward the real threats while anchoring him to her voice, her presence, her absolute refusal to abandon him to the darkness he feared. Together, they had become something more than either could be alone. Not just a berserker and his anchor, but true partners in the dance of controlled violence. The aftermath had been swift justice. Thorkel, faced with the failure of his carefully orchestrated plan, had tried to flee but found no sanctuary among his former allies. The ironclad brothers, realizing they'd been manipulated into serving another man's murderous ambitions, had turned on their supposed partner with the righteous fury of men who'd discovered they'd been made fools. By sunset, all 3 conspirators were dead, and the surviving members of their force had dispersed to seek employment elsewhere. "Are you ready?" Fenrik asked from the doorway, dressed in the finest clothes he owned. Still simple by most standards, but clean and mended with obvious care. Signe turned from the table where the rings waited, taking in the sight of the man who had transformed from purchased protector to chosen partner. The scars remained, the evidence of countless battles fought and survived. But the haunted expression that had marked him at the auction was gone, replaced by something she'd never seen in him before: peace. "I've been ready since the moment I saw you on that platform," she said, moving to join him. "I just didn't know it yet." The wedding ceremony was held in the village square, in the same space where their story had begun, with silver changing hands and a desperate widow making an improbable choice. But this time, the gathered crowd bore witness to something entirely different. Not a transaction born of necessity, but a celebration of love freely given and equally returned. Bjorn stood as witness, his young face beaming with the satisfaction of someone who'd suspected this outcome from the beginning. Old Astrid, supported by walking sticks but determined to attend, pronounced the traditional blessings with a voice that carried the weight of years and the joy of seeing true love triumph over adversity. Even the village priest, initially skeptical of blessing a union between former owner and purchased warrior, had been won over by the obvious depth of their commitment. As he spoke the ritual words that would bind them in the eyes of gods and men, Signe found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you, Signe Eriksdottir, take this man as your husband, to stand with him in joy and sorrow, in plenty and want, in sickness and health, until death parts you?" "I do," she said, the words carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Do you, Fenrik Ironhowl, take this woman as your wife, to protect and cherish her, to honor her wisdom and support her strength, until death parts you?" "I do," he replied, his deep voice steady and sure. When they slipped the silver rings onto each other's fingers, Signe felt the completion of something that had been building since that first day at the auction. The metal was warm from the forge, but it would grow warmer still from the heat of their joined hands, from the life they would build together. The celebration that followed was modest by some standards, but rich in the things that truly mattered. There was food prepared by neighbors who had once whispered about Signe's choices, but now spoke admiringly of her courage. There was ale shared by men who had feared Fenrik's reputation, but learned to respect the man behind the legend. There was music played by the same bard who had once sung tales of berserker fury, but now crafted ballads about love conquering fear. As evening approached and the guests began to drift away to their own homes, Signe found herself standing with her husband in the herb garden, where so much of their story had unfolded. The gate that Magnus had carved still stood, but it no longer seemed like a barrier between safety and danger. Now, it was simply a threshold between different parts of their shared life. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened?" Fenrik asked, his arm around her waist as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "If you hadn't bid on me that day?" "No," Signe said without hesitation, "because I can't imagine any other outcome. Some things are simply meant to be. Even if it took murder and conspiracy and nearly losing everything to bring us together." "Especially then," she replied, turning in his arms to face him directly. "The best things in life, love, trust, true partnership, they're forged in fire. Anyone can stand together when times are easy. It takes something special to stand together when the world is burning around you." Fenrik smiled, the expression transforming his scarred features into something almost beautiful. "Then we must be very special indeed." "We are," Signe agreed, rising on her toes to kiss the man who had been purchased as her protector but chosen as her partner. "We definitely are." As they stood together in the gathering dusk, the silver rings on their fingers caught the last light of the day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, new opportunities to test the strength of their bond. But tonight, they were simply a man and woman who had found each other against impossible odds and chosen love over fear. In the distance, the evening star appeared in the darkening sky, bright and constant and eternal, like the best kinds of love. It would be there tomorrow and all the tomorrows after that.